There was a boy in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in the spring of 1923, 8 years old, standing backstage at the Chicago Opera House, watching his mother perform, and already he understood that what happened in front of an audience was a kind of magic that required absolute belief from the magician. His mother, Beatrice Wells, was a concert pianist, beautiful and restless, and probably unhappy in the way that women of a certain talent and a certain era often were, trapped between what they could do and what the world would let them do. She played Debussy and Chopin in drawing rooms and small theaters throughout the Midwest, and she took her son with her, and he watched from the wings, learning without knowing he was learning that performance was not deception, but a higher form of truth, a way of making the audience believe in something that existed only because everyone agreed it did. His father, Richard Head Wells, was an inventor and a drinker, a man who had made money in bicycle lamps and automobile parts and then lost interest in making money, preferring instead to travel and drink and tell stories. He was charming and unreliable, the kind of man who would take his young son to China and Japan and introduce him to poets and prostitutes and tell him that the world was infinitely more interesting than school could ever be. Orson learned from his father that the world was performance too, that a good story told well could make you more real than mere fact ever could. Between his mother's music and his father's fabulism, the boy grew up understanding that life was something you shaped and directed, not something that simply happened to you. Beatrice died when Orson was 9, and something hardened in him then, or perhaps it would be more accurate to say that something accelerated. He had already been reading Shakespeare, had already been performing in school plays with an assurance that unsettled the adults around him, had already begun to understand that he could be whoever he decided to be. After his mother's death, he threw himself into that understanding with the fervor of someone who knew that standing still meant feeling things he did not want to feel. He attended the Todd School for Boys in Woodstock, Illinois, where the headmaster, Roger Hill, recognized immediately that this was not a normal child, that Orson Welles at 11 or 12 was already more fully formed than most adults, with a voice that could fill a room and a presence that commanded attention without asking for it. At Todd, Orson directed his first plays. He was 13, 14, 15, staging Shakespeare and Marlowe and Jonson with his classmates, but he was not playing at directing the way children play at being cowboys or soldiers. He was directing, fully and completely, making choices about blocking and lighting and interpretation that showed an understanding of drama that seemed to come from nowhere or from everywhere, from his mother's music, from his father's stories, from all the theaters and opera houses he had been dragged to as a child, from some innate sense of what it meant to hold an audience's attention and then do something with it. Roger Hill became a kind of father to him, or at least a collaborator. Together they edited and annotated the plays of Shakespeare, creating acting editions that stripped away the scholarly apparatus and focused on what the plays did in performance. Orson was 16 and writing with authority about Hamlet and Macbeth, about how these plays moved and breathed and worked on an audience. It was an extraordinary education, not because it was formal. Orson had little patience for formal education, but because it was practical, because it was about making things happen in real time, in front of real people. He left Todd at 16 and went to Ireland, ostensibly to paint, though he had no particular talent for painting and less interest in developing one. What he wanted was to reinvent himself again, to arrive somewhere new and become someone new. And so in Dublin, in the summer of 1931, 16 years old and over 6 feet tall, with a voice like distant thunder, he walked into the Gate Theatre and told them he was a famous American actor taking a break from Broadway, and they believed him because he was utterly convincing, because he had learned from his father that the world would accept whatever story you told it, as long as you told it with enough confidence. He spent 2 years in Ireland, performing at the Gate and then at the Abbey Theatre, playing everything from Shakespeare to contemporary Irish drama, and he was good, preternaturally good, able to inhabit a role so completely that the fact of his youth became invisible. There are photographs from this period, Orson at 17 in doublet and hose, or in modern dress with a cigarette, and in all of them he looked simultaneously very young and ancient, as though he contained multiple lifetimes within a single face. When he returned to America in 1933, he was 18 and already a professional, already someone who had done things most people never do. He talked his way into the theater guild, toured with Catherine Cornell's company, played Mercutio and Tybalt, and somewhere in there he married a Chicago socialite named Virginia Nicholson, because it seemed like the thing to do, because everyone said he should settle down, though settling down was never something Orson Welles was going to manage for very long. In New York, he fell in with John Houseman, a producer and writer who was everything Orson was not, methodical, disciplined, patient, and together they formed one of those partnerships that works precisely because the two people involved have almost nothing in common except a shared obsession with making theater that mattered. Houseman was older, wiser, more experienced in the practical matters of producing plays, and Orson was the mad visionary, the one who would decide to stage Macbeth with an all-black cast set in Haiti during the reign of Henri Christophe, and Houseman was the one who would figure out how to actually do it. The Voodoo Macbeth opened in April of 1936 at the Lafayette Theater in Harlem, under the auspices of the Federal Theater Project, the New Deal's attempt to keep theater alive during the Depression. Orson was 20 years old and directing a cast of over 100, including dozens of professional actors and musicians who had every reason to resent this white kid telling them what to do, but he had a gift for getting people to follow him, not through charm, though he could be charming when he wanted to be, but through sheer force of conviction. He made people believe that what they were doing mattered, that they were not just putting on a play, but creating something that had never existed before. The production was a sensation, primitive and powerful and utterly unlike anything Broadway had seen. The witches were voodoo priestesses, the Scottish heath became a jungle, and the whole thing pulsed with drums and chanting, and an atmosphere of genuine dread. Critics called it thrilling and barbaric and electrifying, and the fact that a 20-year-old had directed it seemed almost beside the point. What mattered was the work, and the work announced that someone new had arrived, someone who understood that theater was not about realism or naturalism or any of the prevailing fashions, but about creating a world so complete and so compelling that the audience had no choice but to enter it. Over the next 2 years, Orson and Houseman staged one astonishing production after another. Horse Eats Hat, a Marx Brothers-style farce. Dr. Faustus, with Orson playing Marlowe's doomed scholar in a production that used light and shadow to create an atmosphere of supernatural menace. Mark Blitzstein's The Cradle Will Rock, a pro-union musical that the government tried to shut down, leading to the famous night when the cast and audience marched 20 blocks to another theater and performed the show with the actors scattered throughout the audience, and Blitzstein playing piano on stage, because the union work. That last production, the defiance of it, the sheer audacity, was pure Orson. He understood instinctively that theater was a place where you could break the rules, where the normal order of things could be suspended, and he loved that, loved the feeling of doing something that no one had given him permission to do. It was this impulse, more than anything, that defined him, not just the talent, which was immense, but the refusal to accept anyone else's idea of what was possible. In 1937, he and Houseman officially founded the Mercury Theater, their own company, named after the messenger god, and for 2 years it was the most vital, exciting theater in America. They did Julius Caesar as a commentary on fascism, set in a modern dictatorship with actors in military uniforms and the audience feeling the chill of Europe's slide toward war. Orson played Brutus, the idealist who murders his friend for the sake of an idea and loses everything. It was not hard to see the parallel with Orson himself, the man who believed so completely in his own vision that he could justify anything in service of it. But theater, for all its immediacy and power, was a limited medium. You performed for a few hundred people a night in one city, and then it was over, gone, nothing left but reviews and memories. Radio was different. Radio reached millions, and Orson understood that radio was not just theater without pictures, but its own art form, intimate and immediate, sound and voice and music creating images in the listener's mind that no camera could capture. He had been doing radio work for years, performing in adaptations and series, and he was good at it, his voice perfect for the medium, deep and flexible and utterly commanding. In 1938, the Mercury Theater got its own radio series on CBS, The Mercury Theater on the Air, Sunday nights, adapting classic novels and plays into hour-long episodes, and for the most part it was respectable work, well done, but not earth-shaking. And then came the night of October 30th, 1938, a week before Halloween, and they did an adaptation of H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds, and everything changed. The script, written primarily by Howard Koch, reimagined Wells's Victorian invasion story as a contemporary news broadcast, a series of increasingly panicked bulletins interrupting a program of dance music, reporting strange explosions on Mars, then a meteor landing in New Jersey, then the horrifying realization that it was not a meteor, but a spaceship, and the Martians were emerging, and they had heat rays, and they were killing everyone. Orson played the astronomer and several other roles, but more importantly he directed the production, shaping its rhythms, building the tension, understanding that the key was to make it sound real, not to wink at the audience but to play it absolutely straight, to make people forget they were listening to a radio play and believe, at least for a few minutes, that they were listening to the world ending. And it worked, or rather, it worked too well, or the myth says it worked too well. The reports the next day said that thousands of people panicked, fled their homes, called the police, prepared for invasion. Later research has suggested that the panic was largely exaggerated, that most people understood it was a play, and that newspapers' competitors with radio for advertising dollars were happy to play up the story of mass hysteria to make radio look dangerous and irresponsible. But true or not, the story stuck, and overnight Orson Welles became the most famous 23-year-old in America, the boy genius who had fooled a nation, who had demonstrated the terrifying power of mass media to shape reality. His face was on the cover of Time magazine, and Hollywood came calling. The contract RKO offered him in 1939 was unprecedented, possibly the most generous deal any studio had ever given a director, and certainly the most generous given to someone who had never made a film. He would produce, direct, write, and act. He would have final cut, meaning the studio could not change his film without his approval. He would have unprecedented control over every aspect of production. It was the kind of deal that studio executives would spend the next decade regretting and that other directors would point to with envy and disbelief. Why did RKO do it? Because they were desperate. The studio was in financial trouble and needed something, anything, that would generate excitement and prestige. And Orson was exciting, a genuine phenomenon, and young enough that maybe he could be the future of cinema, if cinema had a future, which in 1939 was not entirely clear, which in 1930 had. Orson went to Hollywood with his Mercury players, Joseph Cotten, Everett Sloane, Agnes Moorehead, and the rest actors who had never appeared in films but whom Orson trusted, who spoke his language. He was 24 years old and completely unprepared for the machinery of filmmaking. The technical complexity of it, the sheer scale of it. Theater was actors and lights and maybe some scenery. Film was cameras and lenses and lighting and sound and editing and laboratories, and all of it requiring specialists and technicians and craftspeople who knew more about their specific jobs than Orson ever would. So he did what he always did. He learned. He spent months at RKO watching films, old films, silent films, foreign films, studying how they worked, how shots were constructed, how scenes were cut together. He talked to cinematographers and editors and grips, asking questions, absorbing everything. And he watched John Ford's Stagecoach over and over, 40 times or more, studying Ford's clarity, his economy, the way every shot contained exactly what it needed, and nothing more. But what to make? He and Houseman developed a project called Heart of Darkness, Conrad's novel adapted as a film that would be shot entirely from the first-person perspective, the camera as Marlowe, and it was wildly ambitious and probably unfillable, at least on the budget RKO was willing to spend. Then a project called The Smiler with a Knife, a spy thriller, which fell apart when Lucille Ball turned down the lead role. And then Herman Mankiewicz, a screenwriter and notorious drunk, came to Orson with an idea. Mankiewicz had been thinking about William Randolph Hearst, the newspaper magnate, the most powerful publisher in America, the man who lived in a castle in California and collected art and mistresses and politicians. Mankiewicz knew that world. He had been a guest at San Simeon, Hearst's estate, had seen up close the megalomania and the loneliness and the desperate need for control that defined Hearst's life. And he thought there was a story there, the story of a man who had everything and it was not enough, who built an empire and lost the only thing he ever really wanted. Orson saw it immediately. This was the subject, the great American story, the tycoon, the self-made man who destroyed himself. And it was also a structure, a puzzle, a story told in fragments, different people remembering the same man differently, and the audience left to assemble the pieces and realize that they do not quite fit, that the truth about a person might not be something you can ever fully know. They worked on the script together, Orson and Mankiewicz, though how much each contributed would become a point of bitter dispute later. Mankiewicz wrote the first drafts, long and sprawling and full of incident, and Orson cut and shaped and added and changed, making it tighter, more cinematic, giving it the structure of a detective story, a reporter searching for the meaning of a dead man's last word. Rosebud. Filming began in the summer of 1940. Orson cast himself as Charles Foster Kane, the tycoon, even though he was only 25 and would need to play the character from youth to old age. He cast Joseph Cotten as Jedediah Leland, Kane's best friend and eventual betrayer, and Everett Sloane and Agnes Moorehead and all the rest of the Mercury players, people he trusted. And he hired Greg Toland as cinematographer, one of the best in the business, a man who understood light and shadow and composition, and who was excited by the prospect of working with someone who knew nothing and therefore had no preconceptions about what a film was supposed to look like. Together, Orson and Toland created a visual style that had never been seen in Hollywood before. They used deep focus, keeping everything from the foreground to the background in sharp clarity, so that the image had depth, so that you could see multiple planes of action simultaneously. They put ceilings on the sets, which was almost never done because it made lighting difficult, but which made the spaces feel enclosed, oppressive, real. They used low angles, shooting up at actors to make them loom and dominate the frame. They overlapped dialogue, people talking over each other the way people do in real life, not waiting politely for their turn. They used long takes, letting scenes play out without cutting, the camera moving through space in ways that felt fluid and dreamlike. None of this was entirely unprecedented. Jean Renoir had used deep focus. Citizen Kane borrowed liberally from expressionist cinema. The long takes recalled Max Ophuls, but no one had combined all of these techniques in a single American film, and no one had done it with such audacity and confidence. Watching Citizen Kane, even now, you can feel the excitement of it, the sense that the people making it knew they were doing something new, something that would change what film could be. The story they told was the story of a man's life in pieces. Kane begins with wealth and idealism, buying a struggling newspaper and turning it into a crusade for the common man, attacking the trusts and the corruption of the powerful. But success corrupts him. He builds an empire, marries the niece of a president, runs for governor. Then a scandal, his affair with a shopgirl, destroys his political ambitions, and he retreats into his private kingdom, Xanadu, a vast estate filled with art and statues and treasures he buys but never looks at. His second wife, Susan Alexander, a singer with limited talent, becomes his project. He forces her onto the opera stage, and when the world laughs at her, he builds her an opera house, and still she fails. She leaves him, and he dies alone, surrounded by his possessions, whispering Rosebud, a word no one understands. The reporter, trying to solve the mystery, interviews the people who knew Kane: his business manager, his best friend, his second wife, and each tells a different story. To one, he was a visionary; to another, a tyrant; to a third, a lonely child who never grew up. And in the end the reporter gives up, concludes that maybe one word cannot explain a man's life, that people are more complicated than that. But the camera, in the final moments, shows us what no character sees: a workman throwing junk into a furnace, and among the junk is a sled, and on the sled is painted the word Rosebud. It was the sled Kane was playing with as a boy when his mother sent him away, the last moment of innocence before wealth and ambition took over his life. It is a brilliant ending, and also a cheat, because it offers an answer that the film has already told us is insufficient. Kane is not explained by his childhood or by any single thing. He is the sum of everything, and also irreducible to any explanation. The film is about the impossibility of knowing another person, and it is structured to make you feel that impossibility, to give you pieces that do not quite add up. The film wrapped in October of 1940, and then came the editing, which Orson approached with the same obsessive control he brought to everything. He worked with the editor Robert Wise, spending months in the cutting room, shaping the film's rhythms, its pacing, the way scenes flowed into each other. And he recorded the music, a score by Bernard Herrmann that moved from bombast to intimacy to quiet tragedy, underscoring the emotional arc of Kane's life. And then word got out that the film was about Hearst. Mankiewicz had told people, maybe deliberately, and somehow the gossip columnist Luella Parsons, who worked for Hearst, got hold of it, and she told Hearst, and Hearst was furious. He sent his lawyers, demanded to see the film, threatened to sue RKO into oblivion if they released it. The studio panicked. They offered to destroy the negative if Hearst would agree not to sue, and for a moment it looked like Citizen Kane would never be seen, would be buried before it was born. But George Schaefer, the head of RKO, held firm. He believed in the film, or maybe just believed that destroying it would be a public relations disaster, and so in May of 1941, Citizen Kane was released in a limited number of theaters with almost no advertising, because Hearst had used his influence to make sure that most newspapers would not review it, and most theater chains would not book it. The reviews that did appear were ecstatic. Critics recognized immediately that this was something extraordinary, a film that did things no American film had done before. But the public stayed away. The controversy helped in some cities, but in most of the country the film was simply not available, and even where it was, audiences were not sure what to make of it. It was too slow, too strange, too unlike the movies they were used to. It lost money, and RKO, which had hoped for a prestige hit, instead got a financial failure and a powerful enemy. At the Academy Awards in February of 1942, Citizen Kane was nominated for 9 Oscars, including Best Picture and Best Director. It won one, for Best Original Screenplay, awarded to Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz. When the award was announced, there were boos in the auditorium, studio executives, and Hearst's friends expressing their contempt for the film and the man who made it. Orson was not there to hear them. He was already gone, on to the next thing, because standing still had never been something he could do. But what next? RKO still had him under contract, and he started work on The Magnificent Ambersons, an adaptation of Booth Tarkington's novel about the decline of an aristocratic Midwestern family at the turn of the century. It was a quieter story than Kane, more intimate, less flashy, but in its way just as ambitious. Orson was interested in time, in how the world changes and people do not change with it, in how progress destroys as much as it creates. He shot the film in the fall of 1941, just before Pearl Harbor, with Joseph Cotten and Dolores Costello and Tim Holt and Agnes Moorehead, who gave a performance of towering emotional power as the aunt whose love and loyalty are rewarded with nothing but sorrow. Orson used the same deep focus, the same long takes, the same attention to light and shadow. But the tone was different, more melancholic, more resigned. This was a film about loss, about the way time takes everything from you, no matter how tightly you hold on. And then, before he could finish editing it, the government asked him to go to South America to make a documentary about Pan-American unity, part of the war effort. It was a strange assignment, and Orson should probably have refused, but he said yes, because he could never say no to anything that sounded interesting, and he left the unfinished Ambersons with Robert Wise in the studio, trusting that they would respect his intentions. They did not. While Orson was in Brazil, RKO panicked. The rough cut was too slow, too dark, too depressing. Test audiences hated it. The studio ordered Wise to cut it down, to reshoot the ending, to make it more palatable. 45 minutes were removed and a new, happier ending was tacked on, and the footage that was cut was destroyed, melted down for the silver in the film stock, lost forever. Orson was devastated when he found out, furious at the studio and at himself for leaving, and the film as released in the summer of 1942 was not his film, not entirely. It was a ghost of what he had intended, beautiful in places, but truncated, its rhythms disrupted, its ending false. And it was a commercial failure, like Kane, and RKO was now convinced that Orson Welles was box office poison. The South American project, It's All True, was never completed. Orson shot hundreds of hours of footage, including a long section about 4 Brazilian fishermen who had sailed to Rio to petition the government, but RKO lost patience and pulled the funding, and the footage sat in a vault for decades, unfinished, another casualty of Orson's inability to conform to the system's expectations. And so, by 1943, at the age of 27, Orson Welles had directed 2 of the greatest American films ever made and had been effectively exiled from Hollywood. The studios did not want him. He was too expensive, too difficult, too unwilling to compromise, and his films did not make money. He would continue to act, because he needed the money and because he was a good actor. But directing the thing he cared about most, the thing he had been born to do, was now something he could do only rarely, and only under conditions that were increasingly constrained. In 1943, he made a version of Jane Eyre, acting as Rochester opposite Joan Fontaine. But he did not direct, at least not officially. Robert Stevenson directed, but Orson shaped scenes, influenced the look and feel of the production, and his Rochester was dark and tortured and romantic, exactly what the role required. He also performed magic at the Hollywood Canteen, entertaining servicemen, because magic was something he had loved since childhood, the art of illusion, of making people see what was not there. He directed one more film in this period, The Stranger, in 1946, a thriller about a Nazi war criminal hiding in a small Connecticut town. It was his least personal film, made quickly and efficiently to prove to the studios that he could work within a budget and a schedule, and it succeeded in that limited goal. The Stranger made money, a modest profit, but it did not restore his reputation or his freedom. It was a competent film, well made, but it was not an Orson Welles film in the way Kane and Ambersons had been. It did not break rules or invent new ones. It simply told a story, and that was not enough. His marriage to Virginia had ended in divorce, and in 1943 he married Rita Hayworth, the most glamorous woman in Hollywood, the star of Gilda and CoverGirl, and for a while they were the most famous couple in America. They had a daughter, Rebecca, but the marriage was doomed from the start. Orson too restless and self-absorbed, and Rita too damaged by her own fame and her own childhood to make it work. They divorced in 1947, and by then Orson was already planning his next film, the one he would later call his favorite, The Lady from Shanghai. It was a noir, based on a pulp novel about a naive sailor who falls for a beautiful woman and gets drawn into a murder plot. Orson played the sailor, and he cast Rita as the femme fatale, and the production was famously troubled. Orson cut Rita's hair, her trademark long red hair, and bleached it platinum blonde, which Columbia Pictures, the studio financing the film, saw as an act of sabotage. He shot the climax in a funhouse hall of mirrors, a scene of hallucinatory intensity where the characters shoot at each other and shatter the mirrors, creating endless reflections, images multiplying and fragmenting until it is impossible to tell what is real. The film was strange and beautiful and deeply cynical, Orson's most pessimistic vision of human nature, and Columbia hated it. They took it away from him, re-edited it, released it with almost no promotion, and it failed. But it endures, in part because of that Hall of Mirrors sequence, which is one of the most visually audacious things in American cinema, and in part because the film's bleak worldview no one is innocent, everyone is corrupt. Love is a trap, feels utterly sincere, a reflection of Orson's own disillusionment. By the late 1940s, Orson had no real home in Hollywood. He acted in other people's films. The Third Man, Carol Reed's masterpiece set in post-war Vienna, where Orson played Harry Lime, the charming black marketeer, and delivered the famous cuckoo clock speech, which Orson himself wrote. He was magnetic in the role, utterly amoral and utterly compelling, and the film was a huge success. But he was only an actor in it, a hired gun, not the author. He wanted to direct again, but Hollywood would not finance him. So he decided to finance himself, or rather, to finance his films by acting in anything that would pay him. This became the pattern for the rest of his life. He would take a role in a bad film, a costume drama, or a sword and sandal epic, pocket the money, and use it to fund his own work, shooting in stolen moments, in borrowed locations, across months or years. His next project as director was Macbeth, filmed in 1947 on the cheap for Republic Pictures, a low-budget studio known for westerns and serials. Orson shot it in 23 days on surreal expressionist sets, built of plaster and papier-mâché. The film is strange and powerful, rough-edged and primal, Macbeth as a pagan warlord in a world of fog and shadows. Critics dismissed it as incoherent and amateurish, but Orson was proud of it, proud that he had made it on almost no money, proud that it looked like nothing else. And then he left America. There was nothing left for him in Hollywood, no studio that wanted to work with him, no audience clamoring for his films. He went to Europe, where he was still respected, still seen as a genius, and he began the long, slow production of Othello. He had always wanted to film Shakespeare, to bring the plays to the screen with the same cinematic imagination he had brought to Kane. Othello would take 4 years to complete, from 1948 to 1952, because Orson had no money, no studio, no guarantees. He would shoot a scene, run out of money, take an acting job, come back months later, shoot another scene. The cast changed, actors dropped out and were replaced, and Orson had to shoot around their absences, hiding faces in shadows, using doubles, finding creative solutions to practical problems. The film is fragmented, elliptical, built from pieces that were shot in different countries at different times, and yet it holds together, unified by Orson's vision and by the powerful geometry of Shakespeare's tragedy. Orson played Othello himself, and he emphasized the outsider status of the character, the Moor in Venice, the warrior in a world of politicians, the man undone by his own insecurity and by Iago's poison. The film is full of startling images, Othello strangling Desdemona through a veil, their faces abstracted and distorted, Iago suspended in a cage above the crowd. The funeral procession at the beginning, corpses carried through stone corridors, the whole tragedy already over begins. Othello won the Palme d'Or at Cannes in 1952, a major prize, and it was hailed as a masterpiece by European critics, but it barely played in America. The distributors did not know what to do with it, a Shakespeare film shot by an exile with no stars and a fractured production history. Orson was proud of it, but it did not restore his career. He remained in Europe, taking acting jobs, appearing in dozens of films, some good, most not. He was Mr. Arkadin in a film he wrote and directed, another story of a tycoon with a secret past, and he was a dozen other roles in films he did not care about, speaking lines in English or French or whatever language they wanted, collecting his paycheck and moving on. In 1955, he returned to Hollywood for a few months and directed a film that would become, in some ways, more famous than Kane, though it was made with a fraction of the resources and a fraction of the respect. Touch of Evil, a noir based on a pulp novel by Whit Masterson, was supposed to be a quick, professional job. Orson the hired director on a Universal Pictures B-movie. But Orson could not do anything by half, and he rewrote the script, turned it into something baroque and hallucinatory, a story of corruption and border towns and the death of the old America. He cast Charlton Heston as the Mexican narcotics cop, Janet Leigh as his American wife, and himself as Hank Quinlan, a corrupt police captain who plants evidence and rules his town through fear and cunning. Quinlan is one of Orson's great performances, grotesque and tragic, a man so far past his own moral boundaries that he has forgotten they ever existed. Orson played him as obese and sweating and relentless, a monster and also pitiable, someone who had probably once been good and had lost himself somewhere along the way. The film opens with one of the most famous shots in cinema, a single unbroken take lasting over 3 minutes. The camera cranes down to a car, follows the car through the streets of a border town, crosses back and forth between Mexico and America, introduces the main characters, all in one fluid motion, and then the car explodes. It is a virtuoso piece of filmmaking, showing off but also storytelling, establishing the world and the stakes in a single, continuous gesture. The rest of the film is equally inventive, full of tilted angles and strange dreamlike compositions. Orson shot it in the shabby glamour of Venice, California, using real locations, real decay, making the border town feel like a place out of time, corrupt and exhausted. And the story itself is a noir taken to its logical extreme, a world where the hero is righteous but ineffectual and the villain is effective but damned. And in the end the villain is destroyed, not because justice prevails, but because his own corruption has hollowed him out, until there is nothing left. Universal hated it. They took it away from Orson, re-edited it, shot new scenes without his involvement, and released it as the bottom half of a double bill. It was a failure, dismissed by critics as a messy, overheated B-movie, and Orson left America again, this time for good. He would not direct another Hollywood film for more than a decade. He lived in Europe, mostly in Spain, taking acting jobs, appearing on television, becoming a kind of professional raconteur, famous for his voice and his wit and his stories about the old days. He appeared on talk shows on The Dean Martin Show and The Tonight Show, charming audiences with anecdotes about Kane and Hearst and Hollywood's golden age, and it was clear that he had become a kind of monument to himself, the boy genius who had made the greatest film ever and then spent the rest of his life being punished for it. But he was still making films, or trying to. In the early 1960s, he began shooting Don Quixote, a project he would work on intermittently for more than a decade, filming scenes whenever he had money, casting non-actors, shooting handheld in streets and fields and wherever he could set up a camera. He reimagined Cervantes' novel as a story about a man out of time, Don Quixote wandering through the modern world, tilting at windmills that are now industrial structures, baffled by television and advertising and the sheer speed of contemporary life. Orson was Quixote in a sense, a man who believed in things that no one else believed in anymore, and the film was a kind of self-portrait, ragged and unfinished and impossible to complete, because Orson kept changing it, kept adding scenes, kept reimagining what it was supposed to be. He also shot a version of Kafka's The Trial, completed and released in 1962, with Anthony Perkins as Joseph K. It is one of Orson's strangest films, shot in Zagreb and Paris in brutalist architecture and empty spaces that feel vast and oppressive. The film is about bureaucracy and guilt and the impossibility of justice, and Orson directed it as a nightmare, all harsh shadows and distorted perspectives, Joseph K. wandering through a world that makes no sense, accused of a crime he does not understand, destroyed by a system that exists only to perpetuate itself. Some critics admired The Trial, saw it as Orson's most experimental work, but it was not a success, and it reinforced the idea that Orson Welles was no longer a commercial filmmaker, if he had ever been one. He was an artist, a term that in Hollywood has always been more insult than compliment, and he was increasingly marginalized, a figure of the past. In 1966 he appeared in A Man for All Seasons, Fred Zinnemann's film about Thomas More, and Orson played Cardinal Wolsey, a small role but a powerful one, and his performance reminded people that he was, when he wanted to be, one of the great actors, able to convey complexity and intelligence and moral ambiguity with just a look or a line reading. But these were cameos, not the work he wanted to do. He began shooting The Other Side of the Wind in 1970, and this would become his final obsession. His White Whale, the film he spent the last 15 years of his life trying to complete. It was a film about an old director, played by John Huston, trying to make a comeback, surrounded by sycophants and critics and documentarians, and it was clearly, painfully autobiographical. The director of the film is making an experimental art film that no one understands, and the movie within the movie is all sex and violence and disconnected images, a parody of the European art cinema of the 60s and 70s. Orson shot for years whenever he could scrape together money, with a constantly changing cast and crew, and the production became legendary for its chaos and ambition. He was trying to do something new, to capture the way film and fame in the 60s had fragmented everything, and the result was a kaleidoscope, intentionally disjointed, dozens of cameras shooting the same scene from different angles, the film cutting between them to create a sense of surveillance and paranoia. But it was never finished. The money ran out, or rather the financing became impossibly complicated, tied up in international deals and legal disputes, and Orson could not afford to complete the editing, could not get the footage released. He kept working on it, kept trying to find a way to finish it, but by the early 80s it was clear that it might never be seen, that it would become another piece of Orson Welles' mythology, the great lost film. He acted to pay the bills. He appeared in Catch-22 and The Muppet Movie and Casino Royale and dozens of other films, some respectable, some embarrassing. He did commercials for Wine Paul Masson, delivering the line, "We will sell no wine before its time," with such authority that it became iconic, though it was also a little sad, this man who had made Citizen Kane hawking cheap wine on television. He appeared on talk shows, still charming, still full of stories, but there was a weariness now, a sense that he had become a performance of himself, the enfant terrible who was now in his 60s and no longer terrible, just a reminder of what Hollywood had once been and was no longer. In interviews, he talked about his unfinished projects, about Don Quixote and The Other Side of the Wind, and a dozen other films he wanted to make, and he insisted that he was not bitter, that he had done what he wanted to do, that he had lived the life he chose. But the bitterness was there under the surface, the knowledge that he had been the greatest filmmaker in America, and had been allowed to make only a handful of films under conditions that were never right, never what they should have been. In 1975, the American Film Institute gave him a Lifetime Achievement Award, and at the ceremony his friends and collaborators gathered to honor him, but Orson was not sentimental. He made a speech about how he did not want to be remembered, did not want to be a monument, wanted only to keep working, and it was clear that the award felt to him like a tombstone, a marker of the past when he still believed in the future. He kept working, or trying to. He shot a film called The Dreamers, about old men sitting in a room telling stories, and it was unfinished. He shot footage for a documentary about magic, his first love, and it was unfinished. He wrote scripts that no one would finance. He talked about projects that would never happen. He was still Orson Welles, still brilliant, still capable of astonishing work, but the system had no place for him, and the audience that might have supported him had never quite materialized. He died on October 10, 1985, alone in his house in Los Angeles, at the age of 70. He was working on The Other Side of the Wind until the end, still trying to finish it, still believing that somehow it would come together. The obituaries called him a genius and a failure, which was accurate but insufficient. He had made some of the greatest films in cinema history and had been systematically prevented from making more, and whether that was his fault, his arrogance, his perfectionism, his inability to compromise, or the system's fault, Hollywood's fear of talent, its need to punish anyone who did not conform, is a question without a clear answer. The Other Side of the Wind was finally completed and released in 2018, more than 30 years after his death, cobbled together from thousands of reels of footage, edited by a team of archivists and filmmakers trying to honor his intentions. It is a strange, brilliant, maddening film, full of ideas and provocations and half-finished thoughts, and watching it you can feel the frustration of it, the sense of a man trying to say something important and being constantly interrupted, the footage fragmented not by design but by necessity, because he could never afford to shoot it all at once, could never finish before the money ran away again. Citizen Kane remains what it has always been, the film that tops every list, the greatest film ever made according to critics and scholars and historians, though in 2022 it was finally displaced from the top of the Sight and Sound poll by Vertigo, which somehow felt appropriate, the dethroning of one myth by another. But Kane's reputation is secure, untouchable, not because it is perfect, though it is close, but because it represents a possibility, the idea that film can be art, that a director can have a vision and impose it on the medium, that rules can be broken and new ones invented. And that is what Orson Welles gave cinema, not just one great film, but the idea that greatness was possible, that a 25-year-old with no experience could reinvent the language of film, could make something no one had seen before, and make it seem inevitable. Every filmmaker who came after him was working in the shadow of Kane, whether they knew it or not, because Kane was the film that proved that film could do anything, could be as complex and layered and profound as a novel, could be beautiful and true and devastating all at once. But the other legacy, the darker one, is the story of what happened after. Orson Welles made the greatest film ever made, and spent the next 44 years being punished for it, denied the resources and the freedom to make anything comparable, forced to scrounge and beg and compromise, and still never quite finish what he started. It is a story about how America treats its artists, how success and ambition are forgiven only if they are safely contained, how genius is admired in retrospect but resented in person. There is a photograph of Orson from the early 1940s, maybe 26 or 27, lean and intense, staring at the camera with an expression that is both defiant and amused, as though he knows exactly what is coming and does not care. And there is another photograph from the early 80s, Orson in his 60s, heavy and bearded and tired, holding a cigar, and the defiance is still there, but the amusement is gone, replaced by something harder to name, a kind of weary knowledge. Between those two photographs is the whole story. The boy genius who arrived in Hollywood with a contract that gave him everything and made the film that changed cinema forever, and the old man who spent decades in exile making fragments of films on borrowed money, becoming a kind of joke, the genius who could not get arrested, the man with the wine commercials, but the work remains. Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons and Touch of Evil, and Othello and The Lady from Shanghai and Chimes at Midnight, his Shakespeare film about Falstaff, which he made in 1965 and which some consider his masterpiece, a film about aging and betrayal and the death of friendship. Orson played Falstaff, the fat knight, the buffoon, the man who loved Prince Hal and was rejected by him when Hal became king, and you can feel Orson in that performance, the sense of a man who had been young and brilliant and is now old and abandoned, still vital, still full of life, but no longer wanted. The battle scene in Chimes at Midnight, the Battle of Shrewsbury, is one of the greatest action sequences ever filmed, brutal and chaotic and exhausting, shot in a muddy field in Spain with a tiny budget and a handful of extras, and Orson made it feel epic, made it feel like the end of something, the death of chivalry and honor, and all the old certainties. The knights hack at each other in the mud, and it is not glorious, it is stupid and pointless, and when it is over, Falstaff walks through the field of corpses, and you know that this world is finished, that the new king will have no place for men like him. Orson understood that, understood what it meant to be obsolete, to have outlived your moment. He had been the future once, and then the future moved on without him, and he was left trying to work in a world that had decided it did not need him anymore. But he kept working. That is the thing to remember. He kept making films, kept writing scripts, kept appearing in terrible movies to fund his own projects, kept believing that the next film would be the one that worked, the one that broke through. He never stopped. He never gave in. He was defeated by the system, yes, but he never accepted the defeat. He kept fighting, kept creating, kept trying to make the films he saw in his head, and if most of them were never finished, if most of them exist only as fragments and rumors and footage and archives, that does not mean they do not matter. There is something heroic in that, in the refusal to quit, in the insistence that the work is what matters, not the success or the recognition or the career. Orson Welles made Citizen Kane at 25, and could have spent the rest of his life dining out on that achievement, could have become a professional ex-genius, a Hollywood elder statesman, a safe and respected figure. But he did not want that. He wanted to keep making films, keep pushing, keep inventing, and he did, at great cost to himself, and the films he made in exile, on no money, with no support, are strange and beautiful and uncompromising, and they deserve to be remembered not as footnotes to Kane, but as works in their own right, achievements of will and vision. The tragedy of Orson Welles is not that he failed, it is that he succeeded too early, too completely, and in a way that the system could not forgive. Citizen Kane was not supposed to be possible, a first film that perfect, that assured, that revolutionary. It broke the unspoken rule that you had to earn your greatness slowly, that you had to pay your dues and learn your place. Orson arrived fully formed and told the most powerful man in America to go to hell, and Hollywood never forgave him for either. But the films endure. That is what matters. Citizen Kane is still the film every serious filmmaker has to reckon with, the standard by which ambition is measured. Touch of Evil is still the dirtiest, most hallucinatory noir ever made. Chimes at Midnight is still the greatest Shakespeare film, the one that understands that Shakespeare was not writing elevated poetry, but human stories about power and friendship and loss. These films exist, and they will keep existing, and every generation will discover them again and be astonished the way audiences are still astonished when they see Kane for the first time, and realize that everything they thought film could do, Orson Welles was already doing in 1941. And maybe that is legacy enough. Not the career he should have had, not the dozens of films he should have been allowed to make, but the handful he did make, under impossible conditions, and the proof they offer that genius is real, that vision matters, that one person with a camera and an idea can change what art is capable of. Orson Welles was 25 when he made Citizen Kane. He was 70 when he died. In between, he made a few more films, acted in 100 others, told stories, performed magic, lived in exile, became a legend and a punchline, and never stopped believing that the next film would be the one. It never was, but the belief mattered. The belief was the work. There's a scene near the end of Citizen Kane, after Susan has left, when Kane walks through Xanadu smashing things, overturning furniture, tearing the room apart in a rage. And then he stops, suddenly, because he has found something, a small glass ball, a snow globe, and inside is a little cabin, and when you shake it, the snow falls. He picks it up, holds it, whispers Rosebud, and for a moment the fury is gone, replaced by something else, something like sorrow or longing or the memory of a time before everything went wrong. Orson shot that scene himself, held the snow globe himself, whispered the word himself, and you can see in his face, even under the old age makeup, a real emotion, something unguarded and raw. He was 25 and playing a man at the end of his life, but he understood something about that moment, about the way success hollows you out, about the way you can have everything and still lose the one thing that mattered. He spent the rest of his life proving that understanding was not just intellectual, that he had lived it, that he knew what it meant to be the boy wonder who became the cautionary tale. But he also knew something else, something Kane never learned, which is that the work is its own reward, that making the thing is the thing, not the success or the failure that comes after. He kept making things until he could not anymore, and when he died the work was unfinished, as it always is, as maybe it has to be. But what he finished was enough. It was more than enough. It was a body of work that changed what film could be, that opened doors that are still open, that proved that movies could be art, and art could be popular, and the two did not have to be at odds. Orson Welles was a prodigy and a genius, and a failure and a legend, and he was all of those things at once, and none of them quite captures what he was, which was someone who made a few perfect things and a lot of imperfect things, and never stopped trying to make the next thing, the thing that would finally be what he saw in his mind. He did not succeed, but he got close enough that we can see what he was reaching for, and that may be all anyone can ask, to reach and to leave evidence of the reaching, to try for the impossible and get far enough that others can see the shape of the impossible, even if they cannot touch it. The films are still there, you can watch them. You can see the deep focus and the overlapping dialogue and the ceilings and the shadows and the ambition, and you can feel the presence of someone who believed that film mattered, that it could be as rich and complex as any art form, and who spent his life proving it, even when no one was watching, even when no one was watching, even when no one cared. That is what remains. Not the myth, not the tragedy, not the what if, but the work. The actual films, imperfect and fragmentary and compromised and still somehow more alive, more urgent, more necessary than almost anything else in American cinema. Orson Welles made Citizen Kane at 25. It was enough. It was more than enough. But he did not stop there, and that is the real story, not the first triumph, but the long struggle that came after. The refusal to be satisfied, the insistence that there was more to do, more to say, more to try. He died trying, and the work he left behind is the evidence that trying matters, that ambition is not a sin, that reaching for greatness, even if you do not reach it, is worth more than settling for comfort. The snow falls in the glass globe. The sled burns in the furnace. The camera pulls back, revealing the vastness of Xanadu, the endless accumulation of things that meant nothing, and then it rises, up and away, leaving Kane behind, leaving the mystery unsolved, because some mysteries cannot be solved. Some lives cannot be reduced to a single word or a single meaning. Orson Welles understood that. He built his career on that understanding, made films that refused easy answers, that insisted on complexity and ambiguity and the irreducible strangeness of being human. He was not always right, and his films were not always successful, but they were always his, always marked by a vision that was singular and uncompromising, and in the end that is what matters, not the success or the recognition, but the vision, the thing that could only have come from this one person, this one artist, this one impossible, infuriating, brilliant man. The work remains, the films are still there. And they will be there long after the myths and the anecdotes and the wine commercials have faded, because the work is what endures, and the work is enough.